All right. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Mike Munn. I'm the president of McAdams, and also I'm vice chair of governmental affairs with the Raleigh Chamber. I want to welcome you to our program today. And first, I want to also thank Jim Hansen and our partners at PNC Bank for their help in pulling together the economic forecast program we have here today. And I'd also like to thank John Goodman, the vice president of governmental affairs for us at the Chamber, and Sarita Hargrove, also in the Governmental Affairs Department here at the Chamber. This is an event that has a lot of interest as we've got nearly 500 folks that are registered. So as we continue to endure the extraordinary times that we're in with the COVID-19 health crisis and associated economic crisis, the Raleigh Chamber is working hard to bring its members, local business leaders, and local government leaders the most relevant and timely information we can during these rapidly changing times. Today, we'll hear from a renowned economist who will share with us the latest economic trends and policies he's seeing globally and nationally, and how this translates to potential challenges and opportunities we will see here in our region and our state. We'll learn about trends in real estate and economic development, talent pipeline, and the economic outlook for our region. So now, before I finish introducing our speaker, I do want to mention one last thing about housekeeping. We'll have a Q&A session at the end of this. Rather than typing in your question, we just ask that in the chat box you indicate you have a question, and Sarita will unmute your microphone and give you the chance to ask your question at the end. So now about our speaker, Gus Faucher. Gus Faucher is a senior vice president and chief economist at the PNC Financial Services Group, serving as the principal spokesperson on all economic issues for PNC. Prior to joining PNC in 2011, Dr. Faucher worked for 10 years at Moody's Analytics, where he was director and senior economist. His responsibilities include running the firm's modeling for the U.S. economy, editing the monthly publication of U.S. Economic Outlook, and covering fiscal and monetary policy for the organization. Dr. Faucher also worked for 6 years with the U.S. Treasury Department and was an instructor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Pennsylvania, so he is our Dr. Faucher, not to be confused with Dr. Fauci, but equally esteemed. He also holds a BA in economics from Cornell University. Dr. Faucher is frequently cited on international, national, and regional media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. He's appeared on ABC World News, CBS Evening News, NBC Nightly News, Nightly Business Report, and is a regular contributor at CNBC, CNN, and Fox Business. We are honored to have you here with us this morning, Dr. Faucher. We look so forward to hearing the insights that you'll have to share with us, and look forward to hearing your presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And if we get this, okay. Let me see if I can get my slides up here and give me 1 second. Okay, there we go. And all right, so hopefully that should be showing my slides. Are we good there?
Yes.
Yes. All right, great. Thank you very much. So obviously, the economy is in a big state of flux right now. U.S. economy entered into recession in March as we saw additional restrictions on movement. And there's just a great deal of uncertainty about the current economic situation. And I want to make clear, as I go through this, as I give the forecast, that there's a lot of uncertainty. I'm going to talk about that uncertainty at the end, but there's simply a lot that we don't know in the current situation, and so that makes it much more difficult to give you a forecast in the current condition, the way things currently are. I think a very clear way to see what's going on in the U.S. economy right now is the stock market. So this shows the various declines of 10% or more in the S&P 500. That's a broad measure of U.S. stock prices. What you can see is it's generally the larger declines in stock prices, those indicated in red, of 20% or more, that indicate that the U.S. economy is in recession. And so in between February and March of this year, we saw stock prices decline about 34%, a little more than a third. And it certainly looks like that this will be officially indicated as a recession. There's a group called the National Bureau for Economic Research. They date recessions and expansions in the United States. They haven't officially labeled this a recession, but certainly it appears that the US economy is in recession right now. And I think that 34% decline that we've seen in stock prices earlier this year, that's indicative of what's going on. Up until this point, this was actually the longest expansion in US economic history. So the current, not the current, but the previous expansion started in June of 2009. Likely by the time it's all said and done, ended in March of this year, March of 2020, and that would make it more than 10 years old, the longest expansion in US economic history. This is a very different recession than previous recessions that we've seen in the United States. So if we think about the great financial crisis that started in late 2007, that was caused by problems in the housing market that spread to the financial system. The recession in the early 2000s, that was caused by the bursting of the tech bubble and was exacerbated by the 9/11 attacks, but there was an underlying economic cause to it. The recession in the early 1990s, that was caused by problems in the savings and loan industry and commercial real estate markets. The double dip recessions that we had in the early 1980s, those were caused by double-digit inflation, the Federal Reserve aggressively raising interest rates to double-digit levels, and that caused two recessions, one of which was very steep. The recession that we're in right now, the viral recession, was caused by an external factor to the economy. The US economy was generally in good shape in early 2020, and in fact, before the coronavirus pandemic hit, we were expecting the expansion that we were in to continue throughout 2020 into 2021. So this was caused by an external force to the economy, the pandemic, and then the public health response to it. So it's very different from other recessions that we've seen in the United States. We've seen big declines in interest rates in the United States. So the Federal Reserve cut the Fed funds rate. That's their key policy rate. They made 2 emergency rate cuts in March that brought that down to a level between 0 and 0.25%. That's back to where it was during the financial crisis a decade or so ago. And then we've also seen long-term interest rates fall. So the interest rate on a 10-year Treasury bond, that's the orange line on the screen. That is a measure of how much it costs the federal government to borrow for 10 years. And you can see that that's fallen from, above 3% at the beginning of 2019 to it's about 0.6, 0.7% now. So a huge decline in long-term interest rates as well. That's a result of expectations for weaker economic growth and lower inflation, but also the Federal Reserve has cut long-term interest rates. So they've engaged in something that's called quantitative easing. They're buying long-term Treasury bonds in order to push down long-term interest rates in an effort not to necessarily support borrowing and investment now, but once this economic activity gradually resumes, lower interest rates will make it easier for households to purchase a car or buy a new home, businesses to finance investment and so forth. And so the Fed has cut both short-term and long-term interest rates in an effort to restart the economy as restrictions on movement are gradually lifted. We've also seen a huge increase in stock market volatility as stock prices have declined. I mentioned that 1/3 decline in stock prices that we had when the pandemic first hit. Stock prices are up somewhat over the past month or so, but still substantially below where they were in February of this year. We've also had an increase in volatility. The orange line on the right-hand scale, that's called the VIX index. That's a measure of how much stock prices are moving up and down. And you can see that we've had a huge increase in volatility, stock prices moving up and down much more rapidly. It's come down somewhat over the past couple of months, but still very high in April and May compared to where we were in 2015, 2016, and so forth, and basically back to Great Recession levels. And I think we're likely to see continued high stock market volatility. There's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know what the course of the pandemic is going to be. We don't know what the public health response is going to be, and it varies across 50 states. We don't know if the pandemic is going to fade and then come back or disappear altogether. So there's just a huge amount of uncertainty out there. And given all of that, I would expect that we will continue to see very high levels of volatility in the stock market until there is a better sense of both the science and what the course of the pandemic is going to look like, but also what kind of response we get from the federal government, from the Federal Reserve, and so forth, and the damage that the pandemic is doing to the economy. So there's just a huge amount of uncertainty out there right now, and that is contributing to that volatility that we are seeing in the stock market over the past couple of months. About 1/2 of the US economy is at risk right now because of the coronavirus pandemic and associated restrictions on movement. So there are a few areas that we're less concerned about. So government, that red piece of the pie, that's about 18% of GDP, US output of goods and services. And we would expect, if anything, government spending is likely to increase in the near term because of the pandemic and the public health response. Consumer spending on healthcare, housing, and utilities, the yellow slice, that's about 21% of the US economy. Now, we've even seen a decline in discretionary healthcare spending. People aren't going to the dentist, they're putting off non-urgent procedures and so forth. So we've even seen some declines there, but generally people will be spending on healthcare, on housing, on utilities. So that portion of the economy is less likely to be disrupted by the pandemic and the public health response. And also consumer non-durables, that's the blue share. That is things spending on food, spending on clothing, and so forth. Again, that's less likely to be disrupted by the pandemic. And in fact, we've actually seen an increase in consumer spending on food as people are staying in more and making more meals. And so that's an area that's less likely to be touched. But the other portions of the economy are much more vulnerable to what we have seen, the restrictions on movement, a global recession, and so forth. So private investment, the orange piece, that's about 17% of the economy. So that's business investment in equipment, commercial construction, investment in what we call intellectual property. That's things like software and R&D. First of all, businesses are cutting back on investment just to preserve cash in the current economic environment because they don't know how the economy is going to proceed. But also, you know, it's difficult to make those investments if your workforces can't come in, and then you're unsure what demand is going to look like over the longer run. So businesses are going to be much more cautious about investment in the near term. And so that is a drag on the economy right now. Exports, the green portion, that's about 12% of the US economy. As I mentioned, we're seeing a global recession. Other countries are dealing with this pandemic as well, and so they may be purchasing less. Supply chains are disrupted, so US manufacturers may not be able to ship abroad, so that's a portion of the US economy is at risk. Consumer durables, that purple slice, that's about 7% of the US economy. That's spending on goods that are expected to last for more than 3 years. So things like automobiles, and a lot of car dealerships have been closed, so people can't purchase those. Appliances, this is typically an area where we see downturns during the recession. During recessions, and so we're seeing spending decline there as well, and so we've seen a 50% drop in auto sales over the past couple of months, so that portion of the economy is at risk. And then all other consumer services, so that's excluding healthcare, housing, utilities, the black piece, that's 26%, 1/4 of the US economy, restaurants, travel and tourism, child care, even things like dry cleaning and so forth, all of those types of consumer services. And we've seen huge cutbacks there. A lot of that spending is discretionary. A lot of those businesses are closed, and that's contributed majorly to the huge decline in economic activity that we've seen over the past couple of months. So about 1/2 of the US economy is at risk right now because of the global recession, restrictions on movement, and so forth. You know, we got the jobs report for April last Friday, May 8th. The US economy lost 20.5 million jobs in April of 2020. That is by far the worst, the biggest job losses in US history. The previous was about 1.5 million as we had demobilization at the end of World War II. You add on top of that the more than 700,000 jobs that were lost in March of this year, and you can see that employment is now back to where it was in 2011. So almost all of the gains that we've seen in employment through the expansion that we've had, and again, the longest expansion in US history, almost all of those gains have been wiped out in just 2 months. This is really unprecedented. The amount of job losses, the amount of disruption that we have seen in the US economy. And I think this chart shows pretty clearly what's going on. This is the employment to population ratio. This is the share of adults 16 and over who are working. And you can see that, first of all, notice the long-term trends. So we had a steady increase in that employment to population ratio, let's say roughly from 1970 to 2000. That was a result of two factors: the entrance of the baby boomers into the labor market, and then also the entrance of women in much greater numbers into the labor market. But you can see that employment to population ratio has fallen from about 63% down to just over 50%. And that literally has taken place over the period of a couple of months. And so we have just had an enormous decline in the share of people who are working. And so it's just been a tremendous loss of jobs over the past couple of months, absolutely unprecedented. This is the entire history of the series. It only goes back to 1948, but you can see by far this is the lowest employment to population ratio that we've had in the history of the series, and I think that's indicative of what we've seen. The unemployment rate rose. It was, a couple months ago in February is 3.5%. That was the lowest unemployment rate that we've had in 50 years. And then it increased in March to above 7%, but it was 14.7% in April. That's the highest unemployment rate we've had in the US economy since the Great Recession. So in 2 months, we've gone from the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years to the highest unemployment rate in almost 90 years. And I think that is just indicative of what we are seeing in the amount of disruption. And according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, it puts the unemployment rate together. The unemployment was actually undermeasured in April because people who reported themselves as temporarily unemployed, and because they'd been furloughed, they probably should have been counted as unemployed. They actually reported themselves as employed. And so that understated the amount of unemployment that we have in the US economy. And we're likely to see millions of job losses in May as well, not the 20.5 million job losses that we saw in April, but certainly job losses will be in the millions for May. This shows initial unemployment insurance claims for 2020. Notice it's a logarithmic scale, so that each line is 10 times greater than the line below it. You go back to earlier this year, even in early March, initial claims for unemployment insurance were 200,000 per week, 220,000 per week. Roughly, that's how many people were losing their jobs every week and filing for unemployment insurance. And then when as the crisis hit, those initial unemployment insurance claims peaked at almost 7 million per week at the end of March. So over the space of 2 or 3 weeks, we went from 200,000 people filing for unemployment insurance a week to almost 7 million people filing for unemployment insurance in a week. So 35 times greater. Prior to this, the previous high for initial unemployment insurance claims was around 700,000 for 1 week. That was during the recession in the early 1980s. And again, we hit almost 10 times that amount in late March. Now, unemployment insurance claims have fallen. We got the numbers this morning. They moved slightly below 3 million, but still, again, remember, we were 200,000 a month or two ago. Now we're at 3 million per week. And that indicates that there are still huge numbers of job losses, huge numbers of layoffs that are underway in the economy. And that indicates that we will have job losses in the millions again when we get the May jobs report in early June. So, and that means the unemployment rate is going to move even higher. So I would expect that the unemployment rate is going to be around 20% a month from now when we get the numbers for for May. This chart shows GDP, output of goods and services, the broadest measure that we have. We also have what we call final sales of domestic product. That's GDP minus a change in inventory. It measures demand for goods and services produced in the United States, as well as gross domestic income, the orange line. That is a measure of the income going to households and businesses in the United States. You can see that, we've had pretty solid GDP growth of around 2% throughout this expansion, some years a little better, some years a little worse. We had seen a slowing in growth from roughly 2018 through the end of 2019. But you can see that we had a significant slowing. GDP is still positive on a year ago basis in the first quarter of 2020. We saw output decline in the first quarter, and I'll get to that in a second. But on a year ago basis, it was still up from 1 year earlier, from the first quarter of 2019. We are going to see a huge drop in economic output in the second quarter. It's simply going to be unprecedented in the scale. And I think this chart gives you an example of some of those declines in economic activity that we've seen recently. So, except where noted, this is the change in economic activity from February to March. We are starting to get some April data in. But you can see that auto sales, for example, have fallen 50% from February to April. Huge drop. Food services, that's basically restaurants, that fell from about 1/3 from February to March. And remember that most of the restrictions on movement were only in place for the second half of March for most of the country. So the full month numbers for April will be much worse. Housing starts fell by about 1/3 from February to March. Gasoline sales fell by that food service fell by about 25%. I misread the chart there. Housing starts were down by about 1/5. Gasoline sales were down about, almost 1/5. Employment in the job survey, as I mentioned, from February to April, we lost more than 10% of jobs over the period of a couple of months in the U.S. economy. Existing home sales were down 10%. Industrial production, that's manufacturing, mining, utilities, down almost 10%. Retail sales, excluding grocery stores, restaurants, auto, and gasoline, down about 10%. Real GDP, it fell about 4.8% on an annualized basis in from the fourth quarter of 2019 to the first quarter of 2020. It's going to, so we're going to see a much more substantial drop. And then we did see a big increase in food and beverage sales, as I mentioned, because of more people staying in. But I think you put it all together, and we are going to see the U.S. economy decline at an annualized rate of about 35% in the second quarter. Now, an annualized rate is the rate that would be in place if that decline in economic activity lasted for a full year. So we are expecting to be the second quarter to be the worst. But overall, on a peak to trough basis, I think we're going to see economic activity contract from the end of 2019, to the middle of 2020 by about 12 or 13%. About, that share of economic activity is simply going to disappear over the space of about 2 quarters. Just to put that in context, during the Great Recession, we saw a contraction in real GDP of output of goods and services of about 4% in that total, and that persisted over 6 quarters. So this is going to be about 3 times the contraction in GDP in about 1/3 of the time. So this is simply unprecedented. The closest analogy is the Great Depression in the late 1920s, 1930s. This is going to be a very intense period of economic contraction over a very short period of time, and is really unprecedented in our lifetimes. A couple reasons for optimism about the recovery. The first of which is that consumers were actually in fairly good shape heading into this recession. If you look at the debt service ratio, that is the share of debt payments consumers are making as a share of after-tax income. That's the orange line on the right-hand scale. That was around 10%, whereas heading into the recession, that was closer to, sorry, I've got the my panel is covering up my scale over there. It's fallen from about 13% prior to the Great Recession to below 10%. So households have paid off a lot of their debt. They've refinanced their mortgages. They've paid off their car loans and their credit card loans. So those debt payments are smaller. So consumers were a little bit better prepared. And the savings rate, that's the blue line on the left-hand scale, heading into the Great Recession, that was about 3%. Consumers were saving about 3% of their after-tax income. Heading into this, it was closer to 7%. And then you can actually see that there was a big jump in the savings rate in the first quarter. That's because consumers didn't have anything to spend their money on in March when these restrictions hit. If you're not going out to restaurants, if you're not purchasing cars, if you're not purchasing vacations, if you're not flying and so forth, the savings rate increased. Not because, in part because consumers were more cautious, but more because they just simply didn't have anything to spend money on. So the good news is the consumers are much better prepared heading into this. Now, again, this is going to be a much more significant downturn, but at least consumers were not nearly as stretched as they were heading into the Great Recession. And so that should bode well for when the eventual recovery comes and consumers are able to spend a little bit more. Businesses, on the other hand, were not quite not quite as well prepared. So if we look at non-financial corporate debt as a share of GDP, that's the blue line on the left-hand scale. You can see that had been steadily rising over time and was at a record high heading into this of close to 50%. So businesses have taken on a lot of debt right now. Now, the good news is that with interest rates low, and the interest rates were low heading into this crisis, but interest payments as a percent of non-financial corporate cash flow, they're close to the average over the past 25 years or so. So businesses certainly have more debt, but at least heading into the crisis, low interest rates ameliorated against some of that. And that's a big reason why the Federal Reserve, the federal government are working very hard to make credit available to small and medium-sized businesses so that those businesses, and Chair Powell talked about this yesterday, he described it as making sure that a liquidity problem, short-term access to cash, doesn't become a solvency problem where businesses are unable to go on because of these hopefully temporary disruptions that we're seeing, that they can tide themselves through until economic activity starts to resume. And that will allow those businesses to get through this temporary cash crunch and hopefully make it through to the other side, so that through access to credit, so that as economic activity starts to pick back up again, those businesses can restart, reopen, rehire, and so forth. But certainly high corporate debt levels are a concern. We are seeing substantial stimulus from the federal government. So we've had a number of programs put in place. Congress has passed 3 or 4 stimulus bills to help support the economy in the near term to make up for that loss of demand that we're seeing from the private sector. And the hope is that as restrictions on movement are lifted, as consumers are able to go out and spend again, that they will have cash, that small businesses, medium-sized businesses will have access to credit and will be able to limp along until economic activity resumes, and then that we will see a restart of the economy later in 2020. So you can see that between the Paycheck Protection Program was initially funded at about $300 billion, and then that wasn't enough, so Congress has added to that about $750 billion in loans to small, medium-sized businesses at very low interest rates, 1% rate, and then if businesses keep their staff on, those loans will become grants. They will be forgiven. And so that is designed to help small businesses, medium-sized businesses through the current downturn. And again, hopefully as economic activity restarts, those small and medium-sized businesses will be able to rehire, will be able to reopen without too much loss of those businesses that would result in much more dislocation in the economy over the longer run. We also have big business loans and guarantees. Those are about $500 billion. And again, those are designed to make sure that big businesses stay open and that they're able to rehire as economic activity picks up. We had the one-time stimulus checks. Those provided about $300 billion in aid to families. Similar, we had extended and expanded unemployment insurance benefits. That's an increase in spending of more than $250 billion there. The idea there is that the extended and expanded unemployment insurance benefits and the stimulus checks, obviously households are undergoing a huge loss of income. We've seen enormous job losses, people's pay are being cut. The hope there is that the UI benefits and the stimulus payments will help tide households through so that they don't have to cut their spending that much. And in fact, we may actually see an increase in after-tax income in the US in the second quarter of this year because of the stimulus checks and the UI benefits. So households actually may have a little bit more money to spend in the second quarter than they would have if we hadn't have seen these enormous job losses. And so the idea there is that again, once businesses reopen, once consumers are able to go out and spend again, that they will have the cash to do so and that will support economic recovery. We're also seeing aid to states of about $150 billion. A lot of states have seen the economic activity that funds their programs decline, so reduced sales means reduced sales tax revenues, lower incomes means reduced income tax revenues, and so forth. And I think this is particularly important to the Research Triangle area. You have state educational institutions, NC State, UNC, Chapel Hill, that obviously are dependent on state revenues. And so revenues in North Carolina, as in all states, are going to decline significantly because of reduced economic activity. I think we're likely to see additional aid to state governments, but the hope is that we don't see spending cuts later this year as states are forced to balance their budgets that would weigh on the economic recovery. And so, the hope there is that aid to states will prevent some of those state spending cuts. And I think we're likely to see additional aid to state governments. And I think that, again, that would be especially important for the Research Triangle area. There's been some discussion about whether or not the federal government, the federal government's budget deficit was already, headed towards $1 trillion heading into this. This chart shows federal outlays. The blue line is a share of the size of the economy, GDP, and then revenues, the orange line. The gap between those two lines is the federal government's budget deficit. So you can see that the budget deficit was already widening a few months, over the past year or so because of the big corporate income tax cut that we had that was passed in the early stages of the Trump administration. So we had a big budget deficit heading into this. Chair Powell talked about this yesterday. I agree completely with him. It is much more important to stop the current crisis than worry about the budget deficit. You'll notice I show the budget deficit as a share of the size of the economy. If the economy is not growing, then the budget deficit is going to widen as a share of the size of the economy. So economic growth will help bring down budget deficits as a share of the size of the economy. It is much more important to get the economy going, to have a strong economic recovery. We can worry about the budget deficit over the next 5-10 years. We need to think about the retirement of the baby boomers, how we're going to fund that, how much we're willing to provide, and so forth. We can think about our priorities in terms of taxes and spending. But the best way to do that is from a position of economic strength where we have a strong economy and a strong recovery. So it's much more important to put programs in place right now that will assure a strong economic recovery. And then we can figure out how to deal with the budget deficit, which is a long-term economic issue. We've seen the Federal Reserve act very aggressively in an effort to support the economy. So as I mentioned earlier, the Federal Reserve has cut interest rates close to zero. Short-term rates, we've seen long-term rates decline. The Federal Reserve has expanded its balance sheet dramatically. So this shows the Federal Reserve's assets You can see that it's increased its purchases of long-term treasuries, that orange portion. It's increased its purchases of mortgage-backed securities and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac debt in an effort to keep mortgage rates low, support the flow of credit in the housing system. And then you can also see the green portion, other, that's assets that the Federal Reserve has been buying to support lending in other markets. So it's been buying asset-backed securities, it's supported commercial paper, which is very short-term corporate debt. Sorry if you can hear my dog in the background there. It's now purchasing corporate bonds. It's looking at making sure that credit flows take place throughout, that credit continues to flow in the financial system, and so that businesses do have access to credit so that they can continue to keep going, and that's vitally important. The Fed is going to be starting its Main Street lending program over the next few weeks. That's designed to lend directly to small and medium-sized businesses that may have trouble accessing cash or perhaps can't get cash through the Paycheck Protection Program. And so the Federal Reserve is stepping in very aggressively. Chair Powell indicated yesterday that a lot of these are emergency measures, that the Fed is using them in response to the crisis, that it will withdraw them as conditions return to normal. But the Federal Reserve appropriately has acted very aggressively to make sure that interest rates stay low, that firms have access to credit, and then once economic activity resumes, that low interest rates will support economic growth and a strong economic recovery. I've been getting questions about whether we should be worried about inflation in the current environment with the big budget deficits and with the Federal Reserve keeping interest rates low and expanding its balance sheet. Right now, the Fed is more worried about deflation, which is an outright decline in prices, broadly in the economy, than inflation, which is when prices are rising. We have seen overall prices decline over the past couple of months. We've seen core prices, which exclude food and energy prices, decline over the past couple of months. Deflation can be terrible for economy. It causes people to put off purchases or businesses to put off investment because they think prices are going to be lower in the future, and that can exacerbate economic downturns. Deflation makes it tough for the Federal Reserve to keep interest rates low, because what matters is the interest rate after inflation. Similarly, it makes it tough for wages to adjust. And so deflation can be horrible for an economy. I think the Fed is rightly concerned about the potential for deflation. I don't think it's going to happen, but certainly that potential is out here. This chart shows what we call five-year forward inflation expectations. This is basically financial markets expectations for inflation 5 to 10 years from now. So right now, financial markets think that inflation roughly from 2025 to 2030 is going to average about 1.5%. That is very low inflation. And you can see that inflation expectations have come down dramatically with the current crisis. If you are a business, you simply can't raise prices in the current environment because there's very little demand for your goods and services. So there's very little pricing power out there. There's a lot of excess capacity in the economy. And so deflation is more of a concern for the Federal Reserve right now than inflation. If inflation starts to pick up a few years from now because of economic growth and because of expansionary monetary policy and big budget deficits, the Fed has the tools to deal with it. But again, I don't think that the Fed should be worrying about inflation. They should be more concerned about deflation. As I mentioned, there is just a lot of uncertainty out there right now. And so what I can tell you is there are some things that I am pretty sure about that are going to happen. The first is that we are going to see a very steep recession. As I mentioned, GDP is likely to decline by about 12% over a period of 2 quarters. The unemployment rate, 14.7% in April, it's likely to hit around 20% over the next couple of months. I do expect an economic recovery to start in the second half of this year. And that's simply based on math. If you cut consumer spending by a huge amount in a short period of time, consumers still need to purchase things. People are still going to need to buy cars. People are still going to buy food, buy clothing. People will eventually need to undertake those medical services that they put off and so forth. And so given all of that, as restrictions on movement are gradually lifted, I do expect to see economic growth resume in the second half of 2020. As I mentioned, I think that inflation will remain low over the next few years. And then I do think that we will see some structural shifts in the economy as a result of the current recession. I think that even before this recession, we were seeing a decline in traditional retail as it moved online. That trend is going to continue and is in fact going to accelerate as people are more willing to buy from Amazon and so forth. So we're going to see a further decline in traditional retail activity. We're going to see changes in supply chains. So businesses may decide that they want to keep some of their production in the United States rather than subject to disruptions from overseas. They may decide that they want to have multiple suppliers rather than just one supplier, so they're not dependent if there's a shutdown of their one supplier and they aren't able to get the inputs that they need. We're going to see big changes to commercial real estate markets. I think the shift away from moving it working at the office towards home is going to continue. As I mentioned, we're going to see a decline in traditional retailing activity, and that's going to lead to reduced demand for retail space, a process that was already underway. So those are the things that I'm pretty sure about. Here's what I'm less sure about. The first is the shape of the economic recovery. I would expect that we would see pretty solid economic growth later this year and in 2021. But a lot of that depends on how effective the public health response is and how effective the various programs we put in place are going to be. If the pandemic fades and then comes back either later this year or in 2021, we could see what economists are calling the W recovery, where we would have a second recession 9 months, a year from now. And certainly that potential is out there if we don't handle the public health aspect of this properly. I'm less sure about how effective the Paycheck Protection Program, the Main Street Lending Program are going to be, and how many business failures are going to be able to prevent. And so a lot of the outlook depends on how effective those programs are. We're in unprecedented territory. I'm unsure how quickly the unemployment rate, the unemployment rate is going to fall. It could be that it quickly moves from 20% at the end of in the middle of this year to below 10%, by the end of 2020, and falls further quickly and ends 2021 at around 5%. On the other hand, if there are a lot of business failures, if there's a lot of permanent disruption in the economy, then we can have a very slow recovery and a very slow decline in the unemployment rate. Similarly, I'm unsure about the longer run impact on economic growth. This may cause structural changes in the economy that mean we have slower long run economic growth. It makes it more difficult for Americans to enjoy a higher standard of living. On the other hand, if the recovery is fast, perhaps we can see solid long run economic growth. And then I'm unsure about the impact on the housing market. I'm not sure how much, whether we're going to see big declines in house prices. Perhaps people are more interested in owning a home after this crisis, and so there's very little impact on home construction once we get restrictions on movement are lifted, very little impact on house prices. So that's an area where I just don't have a lot of certainty about what we expect to happen over the next couple of years. And then what matters? I think the first thing is we have to get the public health response right. If we lift restrictions on movement too quickly, and then if we go through this again 6 months from now, 9 months from now, I think that would result in, first of all, another significant recession, but also a much slower recovery if we have to go through this a second time. How much more stimulus? I put down go big or go home. I think that, given the depth of what's going on, given that the federal government can borrow for 10 years at less than 1%, it makes sense to have a lot of stimulus now so that we can make sure that we have a strong economy. And again, that will make us better able as a society to meet our obligations in terms of the retirement of the baby boomers and so forth over the longer run. And then business assistance. A lot of businesses are struggling, small and medium-sized businesses that may not have access to credit markets. And so therefore, it's vitally important that we provide assistance to those businesses. And again, what Chair Powell said, that we don't have a liquidity crisis become a sustainability crisis. So certainly that's something that we need to do. So here's this is actually our April forecast. We're going to update it from May, and it's probably likely to look even worse than this. The blue line is GDP, the percent change from 1 year ago. You can see that we expect it to fall about 10% on a year-over-year basis. Again, that would be the worst economic contraction since the Great Depression in the 1930s. The unemployment rate, we expect it to peak at close to 20% and then fall pretty rapidly. So, I expect it would be somewhere around 10% by the end of this year, and then perhaps down to somewhere around 7 or 8% at the end of 2021. Pretty solid recovery, but still an extended period of time of high unemployment. And again, this will be the worst economic downturn in the United States since the Great Depression, the highest unemployment rate in the United States since the Great Depression. Let's take a quick look at the research triangle area. This has a below average exposure to this downturn. If we think that the sectors that are going to be hardest hit are energy production, transportation, employment services, so that's temporary services and so forth, and then leisure, hospitality, and travel. You can see that generally the research triangle area has a little bit lower exposure to those industries than the rest of the United States. And so that should protect the area well. It has a lot of employment, obviously, in high tech, which to some extent is benefiting as we have more work at home and so forth. Research industries, pharmaceuticals, those industries are probably going to be less harmed during this downturn than other areas. As I mentioned, one potential problem spot for the area is if we do see big state spending cuts, and that could weigh on the public universities that are located in the research triangle area. And then I think the area, still is poised for above trend growth because of very strong population growth. So if you can see here that, the area has seen population growth well above the national average. During the Great Recession, its advantage over the rest of the United States actually accelerated. I think we're likely to see very low mobility in the near term, so we won't have people moving into the area during the immediate recession. But as things start to pick up and as the area enjoys an above average recovery, I do expect that the area's above average population growth will continue. And so that should support stronger long run economic growth than the US average in the research triangle area. So I think the area is again poised to see above average growth over the long term. Still a significant downturn in the area, probably not quite as severe as what we're seeing nationally, but still a significant downturn. But then during the recovery should see above average growth compared to the rest of the United States. I would encourage you to view our information at pnc.com/economic reports. So we do a US write-up once a month. We also make available reports on the latest economic data. So we had put something out a couple of weeks ago on the first quarter GDP report. We put out a report on the April jobs report. We put something out on the latest inflation numbers that we got. So I encourage you to take a look at all of those at pnc.com/economic reports. And you can follow me on Twitter at Gus Faucher PNC. And with that, we will open it up to questions. And let me open up my chat window here. All right. So I think folks can type in questions. Is that right?
Thank you, Gus. This is Mike here. And thank you for, what a robust presentation, such dynamic time, and some staggering data that you're compiling as you continue to monitor everything that's happening. Just from the housekeeping perspective, questions, if you'll indicate in the chat box if you have a question, then Sarita will recognize you, will open up your mic so you can actually just ask your question directly. So if you, as folks are preparing a couple of questions, I know there's a question about whether or not the presentation is going to be available. We are recording this presentation, and so the Chamber will send out an email to participants to get a recording. And there's also, if you look in the utility sort of window, you'll see there's a handout. It's right above the chat box where you can download the PDF right now of the presentation of Gus's presentation. So I'll ask a couple of questions just to get the ball rolling in case folks are getting some feedback into Sarita. When we're looking at all this data, before recovery can begin, we're going to have to find the floor, right? And so I'm just curious to what data you're tracking, or what might be the best indicators is when we've hit a little bit of stability to at least know that we've hit the floor so that recovery can begin.
Yeah, so I think this chart is a pretty good example of the types of data that I'm going to be looking at. So, as I mentioned, auto sales are down 50% from February to April. I expect that we'll see auto sales actually start to increase in May as more auto dealers are open. Food service, so restaurants. One of the things that I've been looking at is Open Table shows restaurant bookings, and those basically fell to zero. But we're starting to see a pickup in activity there. Retail sales, we get the retail sales report for April. We get that tomorrow morning. That's going to be terrible because it's going to show the full month of declines over April. But I would expect, even outside of grocery stores, I would expect to see perhaps a little bit of growth in retail sales in May. A lot of movie theaters are closed, for example, but as those start to reopen, and I'll be watching movie admissions. We get numbers on credit card spending by various categories, so we'll be watching those types of things. And then housing activity. We get a report from the National Association of Home Builders. It reports potential buyer traffic. We'll be watching housing starts, all of those types of things. So those are the types of indicators that I'm going to be looking for will start to show the green shoots of an economic rebound. And again, I do think that the recovery will start over the next few months. There's only, if auto sales fall 50%, I think at some point people are going to need to replace their older cars, and so we'll see sales start to pick up. If no one is booking a table, and then we start to see reservations for restaurants start to increase, I mean, that's an infinite increase from zero to anything. So I think that we will start to see those green shoots starting up at different times in different industries, but they will be starting up over the next weeks and months.
Gotcha. Okay, and the second question I had was, the severity of the health crisis and the economic crisis is extraordinary in the United States, but we're actually a few months behind some other countries globally. And are you getting some indications from Asian markets or activity there that might be good indicators as to what we might expect a few months from now?
Yeah, we are starting to see a lot more economic activity in China, although, there are again concerns because there appear to be more cases in Wuhan where things were starting up, where the virus initially hit. So I think that those are encouraging. I will say that I think that in some respects, compared to other countries, the United States, the public health response has been more robust compared to other countries. The United States healthcare response public health response has been less robust. But certainly we'll be watching Europe. We don't have a lot of data yet on Europe. They were, a month or so, depending on the country ahead of us. But I think that we will be watching those other countries to see where things go. And I think, one of the unanswered questions is how comfortable are consumers going to feel? It's great if you lift restrictions on movement, if you open up stores, if you open up restaurants, but if people don't feel comfortable about it, then that doesn't do any good. If they feel that they're still risking exposure, then that's going to be a significant drag. And so that's why I think the public health response is so important.
Great, thank you. I'll ask Sarita if she has questions from attendees, or if she wants to open the mic to attendees for questions.
Thank you, Mike. Again, we have now entered the question and answer portion of our meeting. Please raise your hand if you have a question. We have a question from Mark Watson. Please unmute their line to be recognized.
I'm sorry, I don't know if you can hear me or not, but that was a mistake. I mistakenly pressed the hand raise button when I first signed into the meeting, so my apologies.
That's not a problem. Our next question comes from Aaron Paranpi.
Yes, hello, my name is Arun. Sometime back you showed one of your slides, the different areas that were sort of going in the negative direction and going in some that you said would go in the positive direction. it was a pie chart. I'm in the travel and tourism industry. Yeah, this is the one I'm referring to. When would you expect, something like group tours to start? I conduct a lot of group tours throughout the United States. People, I'm sure they have, sitting at home, they have become, gone mad. So they do want to travel. And my question is about group tours.
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. I'm less sure about that in specific industries. I mean, obviously, I think group tourism raises public health concerns, and first of all, I think that there's likely to be large, more governmental restrictions on those. But I also think that people may be less willing to engage in that type of travel than in other types of travel. Now, that being said, I did read that cruise ships, for example, have started to open up their reservations, and there's strong demand. But certainly I think that given the restrictions that are still in place on large groups that many states and municipalities have, that I think that that's an area that's probably going to be slower to recover compared to some other parts of the economy.
Okay, so would you say about 1 year, more than 1 year, 2 years?
I mean, a lot of that depends on the path of the virus or so forth, and I can't really give an answer to that. So
okay, all right, thank you, fair enough, thank you, and that was a great.
Thank you.
Our next question comes from Richard Rupert.
I appreciate everything that you shared with us, Gus. I have a question. What do you think businesses should do, or what do you think they will do to protect themselves against future crises?
That's a very good question. I think certainly businesses are going to, as I mentioned, businesses are going to be looking at their supply chains, and so they may have multiple suppliers. They may decide that they want to source in the United States rather than from abroad. They're going to, look at their IT infrastructure. Are they able to work from home? Do they have the capacity in place? And obviously, for some businesses, that's easier to do than for others. It's fairly easy for me as an economist to work from home. If you're a business that depends on personal contact with your customers, that's going to be less. They're going to have more difficulty in doing that thing. So supply chains, investment in infrastructure, multiple locations. Perhaps if you're a business, you might decide to spread your work across 3 or 4 offices instead of having it all concentrated in one particular office. Maybe you put it across different metro areas. That's a possibility. And then I think businesses are going to look at various types of insurance. One of the examples that was brought up was that Wimbledon actually had pandemic insurance, so they're going to get a big payout from their insurance company because they had to cancel the tennis tournament because of that. So I think that we're going to see opportunities for different types of insurance that are available to businesses that may cover some of these eventualities. So, I think that there are going to be enormous disruptions in a lot of business models, but I think there are going to be opportunities as well for some businesses to step in and help businesses navigate their way through this, so that if there is another pandemic, that they're better prepared.
Our next question comes from Steve Kane. Please unmute his line.
Oh, hi. Yeah, my name's Steve Kane. I'm with the British American Business Council. My question is, should we be concerned about potential bank failures if the economic recovery is weak and delayed, and particularly if the pandemic has a second wave in the fall and winter and carries on until next year, and consequently perhaps a significant proportion of business and consumer loans could go bad? And I know banks are in better shape because of Dodd-Frank and all that, but is that still a concern or not so much?
And let me be clear when I'm answering this question that this is about the banking system as a whole, and nothing that I say applies to PNC specifically. I think that is low down on my list of concerns right now. I think that the regulatory environment that is in place right now, largely in response to the problems in the banking system that we've seen because of the financial crisis, I think the banking system in the United States is very strong. I see little risk of significant bank failures. You may have, individual banks that run into difficulties. But I think, first of all, the Federal Reserve has recognized the importance, particularly in this downturn, about the flow of credit. Has taken steps to encourage banks to lend. And so I think between the combination of the reforms that were put in place after the financial crisis and then Federal Reserve efforts now to encourage the flow of credit, I'm pretty confident that the banking system will hold up through this, and that they will they'll be a part of the solution to the crisis rather than during the financial crisis when they were a part of the problem.
Our final question comes from Sandra Collins. Please unmute her line.
Sandra is not connected to audio at this time. Let us check with her internally, and you can select someone else for now.
Our final question comes from Hamid Lalani.
Hi, thanks for the nice presentation. I've been reading quite a bit about how post-pandemic world is going to be different, and there will be some lasting things that will happen in our behavior. And it's easy to write that as a procrastinator and futurist and all that, but I like to hear from an economist, how do you track such disruptions? Like people say that the commercial real estate business is going to be very different in the coming years because people will figure out that they don't need that much office space.
Right.
And other people say that airlines will have to reinvent themselves because business travel will not be the same again, and that sweet profits they were making off me when I was making 1 million miles on United will no longer be true because my boss will figure out I really don't need to travel that much. So I love to travel. But now he'll say, no, we don't need you to send you to England this week. So how do you track these changes, and how do we look at those things? I mean, should commercial real estate guys look for another job now?
I think we're still in the initial stages of this. I mean, I've given some ideas on where I think some of the structural shifts that are going to be undertaking in the U.S. economy. I don't want to try to prognosticate too much about these types of things. Here's what I will say is that as an economist, I think about what we call productivity growth, which is how productive are workers and how much more productive are workers now than they were a year or two ago. And it's those productivity gains that allow us to have a higher standard of living over time. So, being able to, if you're a manufacturer, produce with fewer workers and with more capital. Now that obviously causes job losses, but it also allows people to buy manufactured goods more cheaply. But being able to buy something online versus having to search it out and try to find it in person, and that allows you to be more efficient with your time. So the question is, what's going to happen with this crisis in terms of productivity growth? You can make arguments that productivity growth is going to slow, that a lot of the redundancies that we're going to need to build in to the system are going to make it mean that workers or their productivity, their output per worker is growing more slowly. On the other hand, you could argue that perhaps we're going to work more efficiently if we're not waiting in line in airports, if we're not spending that money, that's going to flow through to the bottom line and allow businesses to produce things more productively. So I think in terms of the impact for the U.S. economy, that's what I'm going to be watching. Mostly not in the near term, but let's say over the next 3-4 years. Does this result in weaker productivity growth or stronger productivity growth? And I think there are strong arguments either way, but I just don't know how those factors are going to play out. And I think that's going to be, contribute to how people feel about the economy going forward, and how people feel about the political system, and whether we can adjust to those changes. And then let me add one more thing I think that there is a role. I think we are going to see these structural shifts. And I think that there is a role for the government in helping not to prevent these structural shifts, but to helping businesses and workers adjust. So things, again, maybe we need to take a look at the unemployment insurance system so that it serves a 21st century role rather than a 20th century role. Perhaps there's a program called Trade Adjustment Assistance that is intended to help workers who lose their jobs because of international trade. Maybe we need to look at something similar for businesses, for workers who lose their jobs because of these structural shifts in the economy. So we need to develop an economy and the underlying structure around it that allows these types of shifts to occur, because they will occur, but that help cushion workers, help cushion business owners from perhaps the worst of these blows.
This now concludes our question and answer portion. Mike, it's all you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Faucher. We certainly appreciate the insights and all the wisdom you can bring to us in this dynamic time. And thank you for taking time to participate. Thank you all the attendees for participating. Please stay tuned as the Chamber will continue to create new, relevant and timely events and opportunities to keep you informed as we continue to endure this economic crisis. And so everyone stay safe and take care.